Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Venezuela's political crisis continues, with two men claiming to be the country's legitimate leader. Countries who support Juan Guaido's claim to power are redirecting oil payments into his coffers, while Nicolas Maduro's external supporters cry foul over foreign interference. In the midst of this crisis are the Venezuelan people, suffering from massive shortages of basic goods and hyperinflation. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Luis Monroy Santander, who is a teaching fellow in Defense Diplomacy and Development at Durham University. We're also joined by Guillermo Aveledo, who is a professor of political science at UNIMED, and he is joining us from Venezuela itself. Thank you both for joining us and for taking your time out of your respective schedules to speak to us here in the Scope. Guillermo, if I may, I'd like to start with you. Tell us the latest situation in the country right now. What are Venezuelans feeling about Juan Guaido versus Nicolas Maduro at this time?
Well, of course, it depends who you're talking to. I speak to in the situation. It's a very polarized situation, but most people feel energized and highly hopeful regarding the possibility of change in Venezuela. Juan Guaido was mostly unknown beyond political circles and political insiders just until a few weeks ago, because he was, of course, one of the student leaders of 2007 and a deputy to the National Assembly, but he was not a mainstream or high-ranking political figure just until a few weeks ago. But that also tells you something about the situation in Venezuela, the fact that mainstream political leaders and the top leaders of the political parties were banned or were cast aside by the political repression in Venezuela. Mr. Guaido is trying to show, and the opposition is trying to show, make a show of strength, mass demonstrations to build the pressure up in this situation.
Tell us, Guillermo, at this point in time, as far as this stalemate continues, how much longer do you think that either of these men can hold out in the current situation? Maduro obviously under a lot of pressure, and I imagine Guaido is under just as much pressure for something to change.
Sure. Time plays both for and against them. It's as you mentioned, a stalemate. President Maduro is trying to hold on for a few weeks or months, in the sense that he thinks, and the government thinks, that this can fizzle out, that this crisis will just pan out as all the other pressure points will have done in the past. He's trying to, actually, what it seems to me now is that they're trying not to repress the movement so harshly, just containing the movement. Just there's heavy repression in the popular areas, heavy repression in shanty towns around the large cities, but there's no actual large-scale repression against mass protests and mass manifestations in this way. So they can just fizzle out.
Okay, let me try to go to Luis once again. Luis, looking from the outside in, what do you think of the stalemate situation as it currently is? It does seem that both men realize that they can't hold on, both of them, that is, for much longer. They've both, seemingly at least, spoken about dialogue. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think the situation in Venezuela has a range of possible options, but all of them amidst this tense calm that has been going on in the last week. I mean, there's a space for thinking about political dialogue in Venezuela, but the polarization is really complex to see that straight away. And what such political dialogue would need is particularly having sort of an applicable agreement between, the powers that are fighting at the moment, and particularly this big call for elections.
Guillermo, I wanted to ask, why do you think it is, Guillermo, that the Venezuelan army and military right now are still standing by Nicolas Maduro?
Well, there are a number of vested interests around the military, of course. There's nothing that the opposition right now can offer the military that goes beyond what they have now. They have control of oil riches, they have control of mineral riches, they have the control of the borders, and sort of huge power to arbitrate and to control these resources. Maduro has been very savvy to give them a number of privileges without giving them the political responsibility to administer them and to have the fall from them. So in a sense, he's partnered with the military much more deeply than the late Hugo Chavez.
But I wonder, Guillermo, like, I imagine the military realizes that with so many people in Venezuela suffering because of the economic, whether we call it corruption, mismanagement, whatever we want to term it, how much longer can the military stay in the people's favor then? Because I imagine any military in the world doesn't want the people to rise up against it too.
Well, but they have also seen the power of the people themselves. I mean, there's no armed uprising in Venezuela. There's no armed people in the streets. The people have mostly protested in a peaceful manner, and whatever violence they can bring, there's no match to their own firepower. So in local terms, they have no match, and in that sense, I think they are very much indifferent to that suffering right now. But the stress signs starting to show, especially in the lower levels and the mid levels of the military. A number of conspiracies have been quelled by the Maduro government in the last 2 years. A number of about 300 mid-ranking officers are detained without a trial right now, and from this last 2 or 3 years. So there's a tension. And just a few days ago, one of the top-ranking generals in Venezuela asked not the mid-brass, but the lower strata of the military not to pay attention to their families, just to pay attention to the republic needs, to what the country needs, and not to pay attention to their families suffering, because the families will complain. They're civilians, they are weak. And that sort of presses the point that the military is sort of above this. But of course, any person within the military could feel the pressure. What they're trying to do is to give them enough so that they don't move beyond Maduro.
Okay, so let's talk at this point in time, Guillermo, about why we are at this point. Do you think that it's been the perfect storm of this economic mismanagement, corruption that people talk about, hyperinflation, etc.? Or is this, as Maduro and his supporters would say, a conspiracy against his government, against this Bolivarian revolution, against this Chavez ideology? Is that what's really happening here, that the U.S., for example, wants to swoop in and take control?
Yes and no. I mean, as the late President Richard Nixon said once famously, the fact that you're paranoid doesn't mean that they don't try to get you. They're not trying to get you. Of course, there's hostility within the West against President Maduro, against the Chavista revolution. And that hostility is ideological and economical. But we have to also state the fact that the economic relations between the United States and Venezuela are actually very good. The Venezuelan government trades oil and minerals with the U.S. on a daily basis. So there's no question that they're getting this for oil or whatnot, whatever slogan you can pinpoint. The fact of the matter is that in the last 6 years, after the oil boom, after the commodities boom of the 2000 decade, what you have is a huge inflation, huge deficit that has been paid through the printing of money, the huge amount of corruption in the country, and that mismanagement has actually, like the chickens have come home to roost. This has happened because of the Maduro government has had the power to change the economic policies and has not done so.
Right.
But why has not done so? Because all the interest behind this mismanagement. This mismanagement gives the government a huge monetary power over the population and over society.
All right, so let me try to see if we can speak to Louis. Louis, I do apologize for those technical difficulties we've had with you. Tell us, Louis, about your thoughts about whether this is the United States trying to come in, swoop in, if I may say, and take control of the situation, or is this a lot more just an internal issue, do you think?
I think it's a combination of both, and you have to really look sort of at the issue in two frames. What is happening internally with Venezuela? We talk about the humanitarian crisis, economic crisis, and this sort of political upheaval and a contestation of protest that is going on between Maduro and the opposition and their supporters, but also the role of neighboring nations, Brazil, Colombia in particular, who have vested interests in this situation because of how the crisis has affected them and their direct relationship with the United States. So as we look at the geopolitics and at the neighborhood of Venezuela, you can really see an interest in controlling the situation, in kind of having this discourse around the democratic institutions and the need for transition in Venezuela. And it's something that really benefits Trump's foreign policy in terms of looking at two of their key geostrategic partners, Colombia and Brazil, and sort of having this strong pressure against Venezuela. And of course, oil is in the middle. It's an economic interest that has moved these three powers, these three kind of bastions of politics in the region, and that affects particularly the way this possible or not possible transition is heading forward.
So, Louis, I imagine, though, that Guaido needs to be very careful, does he not? I mean, right now he has the support, I imagine, of a significant portion of Venezuelans. But if he were to be seen to be too much in the favor of a country like the United States, with its own history, of course, across Latin America, that may work against him. Would that be a fair assessment?
On the ground, traditionally in Latin America, we've always had sort of a discourse of anti-imperialist, anti-Yankee kind of mentality that plays particularly strong in the scenario that you're putting. Guaido will have the responsibility of kind of strengthening institutions again, getting people to believe in democracy, believe in elections, and kind of take this transition forward. But at the same time, people are learning the power of protests. And unfortunately, in Venezuela, protests have always come with a big deal of violence, particularly from anti-riot protesters, from the supporters of the Maduro regime. So unfortunately, it's not necessarily a peaceful means, which obviously sends a very difficult message and a difficult lesson about the power of transitions and the belief in institutions in Venezuela.
Okay, Guillermo, I'll give you the final word very, very quickly before we go into this first break. Guillermo, tell us, how concerned are you about the transition whenever that does occur, if that does occur? Will there be a vacuum? Can Guaido fill it? Is he ready for it, do you think?
There's no way that a single opposition party can fill the vacuum left by Chavismo. The transition should play out with a different number of powers, including some parts of Chavismo which are willing to go for democracy, including parts of the military as well. So this transition could not be a clean break. There's no way that this transition will be both stable and a clean break from the past. But also, there's need to bear in mind that even though Mr. Guaido has the support of the West and the Western democracies and the Latin American democracies, he also has, the Venezuelan state has strong relations with China and Russia. And you cannot just play them out and leave them out of the equation.
Right. Okay. Gentlemen, we're just going to go into our short break now. Viewers, please do stay with us as well. We're going to continue talking about Venezuela. And as Guillermo, they brought up China, Russia, of course, play a very important role. We're going to bring that up a bit more in the next segment. Stay with us for that. Viewers, we're still here in the scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're just continuing to discuss, of course, the crisis in Venezuela as it currently stands. I'm going to add two new voices to this conversation. We're now joined by Mr. Ramin Vahidzadeh, who is an expert in Ibero-American affairs. He has a master's degree on Latin American studies from the University of Tehran. He is joining us from the Iranian capital. We're also joined by Mr. Bigio, who is a former teacher of Latin American politics at the London School of Economics, and he is joining us from London now. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Isaac, I'll start with you, if I may. What is your reading, Isaac, of the situation in Venezuela? Do you think that the Venezuelans just had enough of their dire economic circumstances and the corruption and mismanagement?
Yeah, well, Venezuela is living in a hyperinflation, more than 1 million%. There is a lack of food and medicines. But now we have the problem that the United States is trying to do a regime change like they have done before in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Syria, and they are trying to intervene in Venezuela. They have, Donald Trump has choose to put a new president, which has not been elected by the population. Nobody knew very much about him few days ago, even in Venezuela, and he knew that he was going to be proclaimed president even before than anybody, as today El País says, El País from Spain. So we are experiencing in Venezuela an attempt by the USA, or a new attempt by the USA, to do regime change.
Is that a fair reading, Ramin? Because I imagine Guaido would turn around and say, listen, constitutionally, because the previous elections were disputed and there was a lot of irregularities in those elections, that in fact, constitutionally, he can fill a vacant spot of a disputed president. What do you make of that?
Well, if we want to talk about the Constitution, we have to take this in consideration, that based on the Constitution, Mr. Maduro in the last year dissolved the parliament because they didn't obey the rules. There was some irregularities in the last election of the parliamentary elections. There were 3 candidates that they were not alleged to fill the seats on the parliament, and or the opposition had to repeat the elections in those areas or concede for the results, and they didn't do that. So Mr. Maduro dissolved the parliament based on the Constitution, and after that he called the elections on the Constituency Assembly, and based on the Constituency Assembly, right now there is no National Assembly there, and so they claim that Mr. Guaido is saying is just in a fairy tale based on the Constitution, if the both parties are talking about the same Constitution here. Yes, if that Constitution is going on, and if we've had the National Assembly there, they reclaim that Mr. Guaido is saying is legitimate and it's viable. But right now we are seeing that this didn't happen. And also the irregularities on the elections is something that is a little bit difficult to understand on Venezuela, based on what observational parties such as US in the past and also many international observers there told us. Even the former President Carter from the United States told the press that the electoral system in Venezuela is one of the most clearest that is existing in the world. The thing that happened in the presidential election, if I may add that too, is that the opposition boycotted the elections. They didn't want to be in the Constituency Assembly, and after that they didn't show up for the presidential elections. So that's the problem.
Isaac, I wonder though, okay, if we talk about the politics and we put that aside for just a moment and we just talk about the economic situation in the country, certainly, Isaac, I imagine that Maduro must have seen this sort of unrest and unhappiness with his government, considering we have such massive hyperinflation, such massive shortages of basic goods in the country. All of that is the responsibility of the government, is it not?
Yes, it is. I am not going to support Nicolas Maduro. He has made a lot of mistakes. But it is also a result of U.S. sanctions. Today, we are watching a lot of reports from several U.S. secretaries of state, ministers, saying that they will like to impose even more sanctions, and they know that the economical crisis in Venezuela is going to be even worse, but they think that this will help them to change the government and that the U.S. companies will return to Venezuela and to profit even more. So a lot of the problems of Venezuela is U.S. sanctions, as we have seen in Cuba and in other countries. And let me talk something about this question of constitution. In the last year, we have a presidential election, regional election, municipal elections, in which many parties of the opposition participate, even the party of the current self-claimed vice president of Guaido. So what is one thing? And the other thing is, supposedly the U.S. is correct, and this is an illegitimate government. The parliament, whether the resolution of the parliament to become another government, to choose new minister, what is the debate? When they do something similar in Spain, in Catalonia, the Catalan parliament met, they discussed, they voted, and they were repressed. In Venezuela, they have not been repressed. They are more than 20 days proclaimed as a new president. Nobody is touching him, and we didn't have any kind of debate. So which kind of democracy is this? They accuse Maduro to be a dictator. He's not putting Guaido in jail, and on the other hand, nobody elected Guaido. So where is the democracy here?
All right, so Ramin, let's talk for a moment about the global implications and the geopolitical games that may be being played here. Because, you know, a lot of people, Ramin, as you well know, are talking about what's happening in Venezuela as the new Cold War setting. They're talking about the fact that Russia has major interests in Venezuela, and Russia will do everything in its power to keep Maduro in office. Do you think that this is a lot bigger, Ramin, than just the Venezuelan people and what they want, but this is actually a new setting for the Russians and the Americans to battle out influence in Latin America?
Yes, exactly. This is a gameplay for more than just the good of the Venezuelan peoples. The thing that is going on is a new war between Russia and the US, as you said, and also China and somehow Turkey, this matter, because these three countries in the last months gained many advantages from the government of Mr. Maduro to help him from this crisis. They gave him loans, they gave him some money, and in exchange they received some advantages in the mining, in the petroleum. And today Mr. Guaido said that I am willing to help China with these contracts, but they only need to accept me as the new president so they can go on. Based on these things that we are seeing in this gameplay, we can foresee that there is not just a reclaim for the Venezuelan people. If that was the situation, the international community had to help both the government, the opposition, and also the people of Venezuela in the negotiations that they had from 2013 until 2018 that there had no result in the actual world, because they somehow firstly said that we are in favor of a national dialogue, but what we see as a result is that they just provocate the opposition to disobey the rules, and that's what's going on right now.
All right, so Isaac, as Ramin there alluded to, a lot of this, Isaac, many people are saying is all about the oil, right? Because Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. So if we're talking about that, and we're talking about these other countries, such as Russia, for example, who has major interests in keeping Maduro in power, what are your thoughts of that at this time? And as John Bolton also said, this is a lot about oil, even from the United States point of view.
Yes, but it is not only oil, it is also gold. Venezuela has one of the two largest reserves of gold. And Venezuela is one of the richest countries in mineral resources. So the U.S. is trying to take control of that oil because that oil is 4 to 5 days. If you ship the oil from Venezuela to the United States, it's 4 or 5 days. If you ship from the Middle East, it's 45 days or 40 days. So for the U.S., it's key, it's very important to control that oil. And for Russia, it's also quite important to stop the United States of becoming even more powerful. And China is the same. So Venezuela is now in the middle of the game between Russia, China, and the USA, between the three space powers and the three big nuclear powers. So we are going to have a lot of problems in Venezuela, and I am afraid that Venezuela could become another Syria, no? And if we have a war in Venezuela, which I hope we don't have, it is going to be even more terrible than in Syria because it's going to splash to the entire region.
Ramin, do you share Isaac's worry there about, war breaking out over Venezuela?
If the diplomatic force does not work, yes, that's sadly be the scenario for Venezuela and the region. I hope that somehow Mexico and Uruguay can have a mediation role here between the U.S., between the opposition and the government of Venezuela, so we do not see another disastrous war, as Mr. Bigio said, like Syria or Yemen in Latin America, because the consequences will be more huge than we can imagine.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word, gentlemen. But of course, we appreciate both insights and analysis as you provided in this segment, and of course for your time. And let me thank all of our guests all the way from the beginning of this program. At the end there, we're speaking to Mr. Isaac Bigio, former teacher of Latin American politics at the London School of Economics. We were also joined by Ramin Vahidzadeh, expert in Ibero-American affairs. He has a master's degree on Latin American studies from the University of Tehran. Earlier, we had Guillermo Aveledo, professor of political science from UNIMET, speaking to us from Caracas in Venezuela. And we also had Luis Monroy Santander, teaching fellow in defense, diplomacy and development at Durham University. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, the situation in Venezuela is complex, but it seems across the board no one wants foreign interference. And the United States, of course, has a track record in Latin America. There is no doubt that there are many legitimate grievances, seemingly, about the Nicolas Maduro government and the way it has been performing, or lack of performance, really, about the government vis-a-vis the economy and otherwise. But there is also the U.S. economic sanctions on the country, which need to be taken into account. A lot of very complex issues, which we will keep a very close eye on here in The Scope. Don't go anywhere, though. I'll be back with our next segment after this break. Viewers, thank you for staying with us here in The Scope. 29 Syrian children have died in a refugee camp in northeast Syria, mostly due to hypothermia. This comes on the heels of extreme weather conditions in Lebanon, flooding Syrian refugee camps there. This is emblematic of the ongoing political and security crisis in the country, with no clear solution on the horizon and international support seemingly waning. To discuss this a bit further, we're joined by Ms. Elizabeth Hoff, who is the World Health Organization's representative in Syria. She's joining us from Damascus. We're also joined by Ms. Arhama Siddiqa, who is a Middle East expert at the ISSI, the Institute for Strategic Studies, Islamabad, and she is joining us from Islamabad itself. Thank you both for joining us. Elizabeth, I'll start with you, if I may. How dire, in your opinion, is the situation in these camps, specifically the one where these children passed away because of their hypothermia and other such issues?
The situation is very serious. We have very cold winter weather at the moment, and the distances that these internally displaced people who are fleeing from military activities in Hajin camp is very long. It's 250 kilometers, and they are stopped on the road and they have to sleep in the open in full winter weather. So when they arrive to the camp, they are all very tired and exhausted, but the situation for the children and the newborn baby is really critical, because they tolerate very poor poorly, the low temperature. So many of them are coming with hypothermia and also with very low blood sugar. So the problem is the difficulty that the women have in breastfeeding and feeding their small children on the road. And many of them are walking long distances or they are driving in open trucks when they are arriving at the camp. So WHO is asking for better access because at the moment we have no access to these people so we can help them on the road. So what we need is really access and also approvals so that we don't have to struggle with bureaucratic procedures.
Okay, so Arhama, what are your thoughts as you hear that from the WHO representative? This is all symbolic, isn't it, Arhama, of how long this entire crisis in Syria has been going on?
Absolutely. But coupled with the fact that these refugees is also the fact that ISIS has been cornered into 2 villages in eastern Syria. So to escape these 2 villages and the influence of ISIS fighters, the remaining ISIS fighters, there are reports showing that these, as Elizabeth mentioned, women and children traveling for days on end in open trucks. I think more than 12 children died because of this. So when they travel and then they have to walk on foot, they have to go to certain points where they're picked up and then they have to travel to refugee camps. And even then they're not spared of scrutiny because even there people are apprehensive that these people, since they came from ISIS camps, they could be ISIS spies. So then they succumb to that scrutiny as well. So the situation for the refugees is very detrimental. And obviously the harsh weather conditions, then obviously the flooding in Lebanon happened. Turkey is the largest host of Syrian refugees, but Turkey stopped in taking refugees 3 years ago. They built a wall. So, and also if these refugees, the areas, for example, Jordan and Lebanon, where these refugees are sort of mingled in with the society, they're not treated well. I had a chance to visit the international alert offices in the United Kingdom 2 years ago. And over there, the woman told me that children, and the Lebanese children, the parents refused to have a Syrian teacher teach their kids, and they actually pulled their children out of school over there. Similarly, Syrian children cannot partake in education in these areas. So the situation for refugees is horrible right now.
Okay, so Elizabeth, in your first answer to me, you said that WHO is asking for access to that camp and to that area. With the current infrastructure in place, what services can the WHO provide to these people who are suffering so much?
At the moment, we are actually fully operational in Al-Hol camp, where we have 2 mobile clinics and 4 medical teams working around the clock. But it has proven to be too late when many of these newborn children are coming to the reception areas of the camp. So what we are asking for is to make sure that we can send ambulances and buses on the road. Many of them are stopped at the Umari oil field, which is on the way, and they are stopped there for 2-3 days. And this is where we need to send ambulances, buses, and medical teams so that we can intervene much earlier and help to save lives.
Right. So Arhama, I wonder then, when we're talking about the various groups on the ground in Syria, and we know that the area that we're talking about is one where the SDF specifically is most involved. Do you think that complicates the situation even more for who can really take care of these refugees who are fleeing, as you said, Arhama, ISIS violence?
Again, as I mentioned, the SDF forces, when they receive these refugees, they also succumb the refugees to scrutiny and investigation to make sure that they're not part of the ISIS militia. The government, Assad government themselves, is not willing to take responsibility of these refugees. At the end of last year, the Assad government had this time frame, this window frame, in which they asked the refugees who had fled the country to come back and take over, to reclaim their property. by showing documents. Now, if you're a refugee and you have fled a country, obviously you will not have documents. And even if by some miracle you do end up having documents and you do go back to the Assad regime, number one, you fled the country because you were either scared of the regime itself, which puts you in a very horrible position with the government, which it's a lose-lose situation either ways for the refugees. So nobody is willing to take responsibility of the refugees. Even Turkey, for example, they're happy if the US does withdraw from its forces from Manbij area. The Turkish are very happy, but then the Turkish are not concerned with the refugee situation.
Right.
They're concerned about refugee influx, obviously, but they're more concerned about the Kurdish. So their main target will obviously be the Kurds. So nobody is willing to take responsibility at this point.
So, Elizabeth, then, as an international organization that you represent there in Syria itself, how much of a challenge do you think this sort of mistrust in these IDPs is becoming for refugees within the country?
This is for us not an issue. The issue for us is to make sure that we are reaching them with humanitarian aid. So all the UN agencies are working very closely together, UNICEF and UNHCR, WHO, and also with the Kurdish Red Crescent Society and the Syrian Arab Red Crescent Society. But what we need is really access to the people. And here it is not a question of whether they are Iraqi refugees or ISIL supporters. We need to help everybody, regardless, international society, to help us to have access so that we can reach them earlier on their journey to Al-Hol camp.
So are you at this time then, Elizabeth, and I'm sure you are in negotiations about that or in discussions about that, how are those discussions going at this time?
Yes, we are in negotiations with the forces in control, and we have also asked the governments outside Syria who are close to the Kurdish and the Americans to make sure that they are helping us to put pressure so that we get access.
Okay, so Arhama, you heard there from an international organization trying to help these refugees, but as you said, that mistrust exists, and all of this, of course, the macro issue here being, Arhama, is that this entire political crisis and security crisis continues. What are your thoughts, Arhama, on where we are right now in any sort of peace process vis-a-vis Syria?
I would first like to point out that with all due respect, the international organizations have been fighting tooth and nail. But if you look at Yemen's situation, they have not been able to even get aid through to the people in Yemen. So I don't understand how, and that's only the Saudi coalition and the Yemeni government and the Houthi rebels. Here you have Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iran, Israel, Syria, the US to some extent, Russia involved. So that these countries in itself, because of their vested interests, are causing a hindrance to the efforts of the international organizations. As far as the peace is concerned in Syria, I don't think there'll be peace in Syria anytime soon, because each and every party has their vested interests. The Russians are happy that the US has announced have announced that they might be withdrawing. They're happy that the US is withdrawing from Afghanistan also, hopefully. The Russians are just happy with that. But Turkish have their own interests. Israel has Iran as an interest right now. It does not care about anything else. It does not care about Assad. The Turks do not care about Assad. They only care about the Kurds. And the Russians just want the US to leave. And the US only care about the ISIS militia. So again, as far as peace is concerned in Syria, I don't think it's coming anytime soon. Sorry to sound like a pessimist, but yeah.
Okay, Elizabeth, I'll give you the final word then. Elizabeth, as, of course, somebody who represents WHO, I imagine, of course, you appreciate that the political situation in the country has a huge influence on your very important work there for people of any political affiliation or leaning. Just give us, if you may, your final thoughts about all of that and any message that you may want to give the international community as well as anybody else from this venue.
For WHO, it is important that we can help these internally displaced people on their way to the camps, that we get access and can intervene as early as possible so that we can save lives. And we are very, very grateful that the media is giving its full attention so that the pressure is increasing, because we need to make sure that we can save as many lives as possible. Thank you for having me on your show.
Very well. Thank you too, Elizabeth. We'll leave it there at that with both of our. We appreciate, of course, their time and their insight and analysis. That was Ms. Elizabeth Hoff, WHO representative in Syria, speaking to us there from Damascus. We were also joined by Ms. Arhama Siddiqa, who is a Middle East expert with the Institute for Strategic Studies in Islamabad, Pakistan. She's a research fellow who works on the Middle East and is an expert in that area. We appreciate her time as well. Now, viewers, of course, the situation of Syrian refugee children specifically who died because of hypothermia and other such related causes is emblematic, as I said at the beginning in my introduction, of the entire political crisis continuing. No resolution seemingly on the horizon at this point in time for that crisis. People continue to die. At this time, children. Of course, the tragedy there in Syria continues for Syrians, both within Syria and beyond its borders, who remain in refugee camps today and tonight. We'll leave it there at that for now. In this edition of The Scope, I've been Waqar Rizvi, though. Thanks for watching.